What do you do when a friend, someone you've stood by, traded with, partnered in defense, suddenly turns around and penalizes your progress? Do you stay silent, or do you stand up and say, enough? We are not just buyers. We are not just allies. We are Indiand. We will not be bullied into submission. What happens when a longtime partner turns the table not in a moment of crisis, but in a moment of growth? That's the uncomfortable question India finds itself asking in the wake of U.S. trade actions under former President Donald Trump. In 2018, the Trump administration invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, imposing tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum imports. India, one of the world's major steel exporters, was directly affected. According to India's Ministry of Commerce, the country exported nearly $1.5 billion worth of steel and aluminum to the U.S. in 2017-18. These tariffs weren't targeted at just one nation. Although over 30 countries were hit, but for India, the timing was jarring. The country had been deepening its strategic and defense ties with Washington. A major defense partner since 2016, India was preparing to spend billions on U.S. arms, including surveillance aircraft, naval guns, and missile systems. At the heart of this shift lies a contradiction. On one hand, the U.S. was expanding defense cooperation with India, approving deals like the $2.6 billion agreement for 24 MH-60R Seahawk helicopters in 2020. On the other, it was punishing India economically under the banner of America First. This contradiction sparked intense debate within Indian policy circles. Can a partnership that thrives on defense and diplomacy survive the sting of economic coercion? This sense of betrayal wasn't just political, it had real-world consequences. India responded by imposing retaliatory tariffs on 28 U.S. products, worth $1.4 billion, including almonds, apples, and walnuts, targeting key American exports. Yet this move wasn't driven by retaliation alone. It was a signal, a message. Partnership cannot be a one-way street. The disconnect grew deeper when, in June 2019, the U.S. removed India from its Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, a program that allowed duty-free access to nearly 2,000 Indian products. The GSP had been worth $5.6 billion in trade. The move impacted sectors like pharmaceuticals, textiles, and auto parts industries that employed millions in India. It raised fundamental questions about how the U.S. viewed India as a strategic ally or just another economic competitor. Amid these developments, the Indian government began re-evaluating its arms procurement policies. India is the world's largest arms importer, according to SIPRI Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, with imports accounting for 11% of the global total between 2016 and 2020. The U.S. had become one of India's top defense suppliers, providing over $20 billion in military equipment since 2008. But growing tensions made Indian officials more cautious about becoming overly dependent on a partner that could turn hostile over trade disputes. This wasn't just a matter of dollars or weapons. It was a philosophical rift. India, emerging as a global power, was no longer willing to be treated as a junior partner. Steel and aluminum tariffs were not just economic tools, they were symbols of disregard for a country striving to assert its sovereignty on the world stage. Such moves felt like a slap in the face. India's stance on the U.S. tariffs goes far beyond economics. It strikes at the core of national dignity and strategic autonomy. The decision to impose tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum in 2018 under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act was perceived in New Delhi not merely as a trade measure, but as a signal of disrespect. India, the world's fifth largest economy, with a GDP of over $3.7 trillion as of 2024 according to IMF estimates, has consistently positioned itself as a nation that values partnerships rooted in equality. The imposition of tariffs by an ally with whom India has expanded defense and diplomatic ties was interpreted as a deliberate undermining of that principle. India's identity as a sovereign, rising power is built on a long history of non-alignment and independent policymaking. While it has entered into numerous strategic partnerships, including the major defense partner designation by the U.S. in 2016, it has done so without compromising its independent voice. The tariffs, however, disrupted that balance. Weren't simply a matter of trade friction. They were received as a challenge to India's global standing. According to India's Ministry of External Affairs, the bilateral relationship had entered a comprehensive global strategic partnership phase by 2020, yet this supposedly strategic partner was now undermining India's exports under the pretext of national security. Justification many economists and trade analysts found dubious when applied to India. India's steel and aluminum industries are not security threats. They are crucial components of the domestic manufacturing sector, employing hundreds of thousands and contributing significantly to exports. The Confederation of Indian Industry C noted that over 600,000 workers are directly employed in India's steel sector. The U.S. tariffs put pressure on an industry already grappling with fluctuating global demand and raw material costs. The move was seen as unjustified, especially because India had consistently maintained trade surpluses in goods, but deficits in services and investment with the United States, leading to a relatively balanced economic relationship overall. Moreover, India's retaliation through tariffs on 28 U.S. goods was designed not just to protect its economy, but to assert its dignity. The targeted goods, including American apples, walnuts, and almonds, were not randomly chosen. They were strategic. California's almond industry alone relies heavily on exports to India, which was its largest overseas market. In 2018, India imported over $657 million worth of almonds from the United States, according to U.S. Department of Agriculture data. By hitting these sectors, India signaled that it would not be treated as a passive player in global trade. The removal of India from the Generalized System of Preferences (GSP) program in 2019 added further insult. That action affected $5.6 billion worth of Indian exports that had previously entered the U.S. duty-free, small and medium-sized enterprises across India, ranging from textile producers to engineering goods manufacturers, felt the shock. The decision wasn't just a loss of economic benefit. It was widely seen in Indian media and diplomatic circles as a symbol of devaluation, a public dismissal of India's cooperative role in the global order. The tariffs imposed by the Trump administration in 2018 were not just seen by India as a trade measure, they were perceived as a form of economic coercion. India had been working to strengthen its relationship with the United States, particularly in defense, energy, and strategic affairs. The two countries had signed multiple foundational defense agreements, and between 2008 and 2020, India purchased more than $20 billion worth of U.S. military equipment. Despite this growing partnership, the decision to slap tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act signaled a shift toward a more transactional and adversarial approach. The rationale behind the tariffs was national security, but this justification was widely criticized. India, far from being a threat to U.S. security, had been recognized as a major defense partner in 2016, a status unique to India and meant to reflect its importance to U.S. strategic interests. India's share of U.S. steel imports was less than 2% in 2017, according to the U.S. Department of Commerce. Experts, including those at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, questioned the legitimacy of citing national security against close allies and strategic partners like India. In retaliation, India announced its own set of tariffs. In June 2019, targeting 28 U.S. products including almonds, apples, walnuts, and chickpeas. These were carefully chosen. For example, India is the largest market for U.S. almonds, and in 2018 alone, it imported over $657 million worth, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The move hit key American agricultural constituencies, many of which were politically sensitive during the Trump presidency. India's decision to implement retaliatory tariffs was calculated not just to restore economic balance, but to send a message that it would not tolerate being strong-armed into trade concessions. Trade between the two nations had been valued at over $142 billion in 2018, with India enjoying a goods trade surplus of about $24 billion with the US, but also a services trade deficit. Despite ongoing negotiations, the tariffs remained in place, and talks for a limited trade deal stalled multiple times. This economic back and forth affected not only business sentiment but also political confidence in the relationship. The perception that the US was leveraging trade as a tool to pressure India into policy shifts, including on data localization, e-commerce regulations, and price controls on medical devices, contributed to a growing feeling in India that the US was treating it as a subordinate rather than an equal partner. Asterisk, asterisk. India's reconsideration of its arms purchases from the United States in response to punitive trade actions is not a reaction rooted in anger but a strategic recalibration. As a sovereign nation, India has consistently pursued a diversified defense procurement policy to avoid overdependence on any single supplier. However, following deepening defense ties with the United States, Washington had become one of New Delhi's top defense partners. Between 2008 and 2020, India signed defense contracts worth over $20 billion with the US, including deals for advanced systems like C-17 Globemaster aircraft, P-8I maritime surveillance planes, Apache attack helicopters, and Chinook heavy-lift helicopters. According to the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA, despite this cooperation, the imposition of tariffs, and the subsequent withdrawal of India's Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, status in 2019 raised concerns within Indian strategic circles about the reliability of the United States as a long-term defense partner. The GSP removal affected $5.6 billion worth of Indian exports and disproportionately hit small and medium enterprises in labor-intensive sectors. For India, the move was more than an economic setback. It was a signal that strategic ties could be overridden by short-term political goals. India has historically maintained strategic autonomy in defense procurement. It imports approximately 60% of its military hardware and is the world's largest arms importer, accounting for 11% of global arms imports between 2016 and 2020, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute (SIPRI). Russia remains its largest supplier. The US had been rapidly closing the gap. However, the unpredictability in Washington's trade and foreign policy has forced India to pause and reconsider the risks of over-reliance on American weaponry. The Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat, Self-Reliant India initiatives further support this strategic pivot. India is actively promoting domestic defense manufacturing, with a goal of achieving $25 billion in defense production and $5 billion in exports by 2025, according to the Ministry of Defense. This shift is designed not only to boost local industry, but also to reduce dependence on foreign arms suppliers that may use defense cooperation as leverage in unrelated policy disputes. As a result, recent large-scale procurement decisions have seen increased competition from France, Israel, and domestic suppliers. For example, India has signed deals for Rafale jets from France and is developing indigenous platforms like the Tejas fighter aircraft. This diversification reflects India's desire to ensure that defense ties are based on trust and long-term alignment. Transactional politics. India's response to the U.S. tariffs was rooted in a broader message: it will not be treated as a mere marketplace for global powers, but as a sovereign voice demanding mutual respect. The trade tensions that began in 2018 with the imposition of tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum later escalated with the withdrawal of the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, in 2019 were viewed in New Delhi not simply as commercial decisions but as disrespectful acts that ignored the evolving strategic nature of India's relations. India has grown into the world's fifth largest economy, with a nominal GDP of over $3.7 trillion in 2024, according to the International Monetary Fund (IMF). It is also one of the fastest-growing large economies, with strong manufacturing, services, and technology sectors. In this context, the Trump administration's trade actions framed under America First felt dismissive of India's economic stature and contributions to the global economy. While India maintained a trade surplus in goods with the US $24 billion in 2018, according to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, it also provided significant benefits to American companies through services, imports, and a growing disagreeing investment climate. The perception in India was that the U.S. viewed the bilateral relationship through a transactional lens, focusing on short-term trade deficits rather than the long-term strategic partnership both nations had publicly committed. 2. The U.S. tariffs and GSP withdrawal affected key Indian export sectors such as engineering goods, textiles, auto parts, and pharmaceuticals industries that employ millions and contribute significantly to India's foreign exchange earnings. According to the Federation of Indian Export Organizations, FIO, the loss of GSP benefits raised the cost of over 1,900 Indian products in the U.S. market, making them less competitive. India's response was deliberate and assertive. Tariffs were imposed on 28 U.S. products, including higher revenue agricultural exports like almonds and apples. India was the largest importer of U.S. almonds, buying over $657 million worth in 2018 alone, according to U.S. Department of Agriculture data. These counter-tariffs were designed not only to create economic balance but to send a diplomatic message. India expects reciprocity, not unilateralism. This stance is consistent with India's broader foreign policy orientation. As a country that has long pursued non-alignment and strategic autonomy, India resists being boxed into subordinate roles within bilateral or multilateral relationships, seeks partnerships based on shared values, respect, and mutual gain especially. With countries that expect preferential access to its vast and growing consumer and defense markets, India's decision to pause or reconsider certain economic and defense ties with the United States in response to trade tensions is not an impulsive act of retaliation. It is a calculated affirmation of its national pride and long-standing commitment to fairness in international partnerships. While the imposition of tariffs and the removal of India from the Generalized System of Preferences (GSP) could have been met with anger or hostility, New Delhi instead adopted a posture of strategic patience combined with firm action. This approach reflects India's evolving identity as a confident global actor, asserting that respect and reciprocity must guide all bilateral dealings. Historically, India has been known for its non-aligned stance in global geopolitics. It has built strategic relationships with global powers without aligning too closely with any single bloc. Over the past 2 decades, India and the United States have significantly deepened their partnership, particularly in the defense and security domains. Between 2008 and 2020, India procured over $20 billion worth of military equipment from the United States. And in 2016, it was designated a major defense partner, a recognition unique to India. However, despite this cooperation, the Trump administration's decision to impose tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum in 2018 was interpreted as a disregard for that evolving trust. India's retaliatory tariffs in 2019 targeted 28 American goods, including high-value agricultural exports. Notably, India was the largest export destination for U.S. almonds, purchasing over $657 million worth in 2018, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. By targeting products from politically sensitive states such as California and Washington, India's response was strategic, not driven by emotional backlash, but by deliberate policy calculation. The idea was not to escalate a trade war, but to convey that India would not be passive in the face of economic coercion. Furthermore, the Indian government's broader vision, as articulated through the Atmanirbhar Bharat Self-Reliant India campaign launched in 2020, demonstrates its long-term goal of reducing dependency on unpredictable foreign partners. This is not isolationism but a pivot toward strategic autonomy. According to the Ministry of Defense, India aims to achieve $25 billion in domestic defense production and $5 billion in exports by 2025. This vision is a response not only to past trade disputes, but also to a pattern of unpredictable policy shifts by global powers, particularly the U.S. India's response to U.S. trade actions is rooted in principle. It is about ensuring that economic decisions reflect mutual respect, and that global partnerships are built on values, not intimidation. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. India's firm response to the U.S. tariffs is a broader message to the international community. Any country seeking to do business with India must approach the table with fairness, transparency, and mutual respect. This principle is not new, but it has become more assertively expressed as India's global stature has risen. As the fifth largest economy in the world, with a nominal GDP of over $3.7 trillion in 2024, according to the International Monetary Fund (IMF), India is no longer a developing nation begging for favorable trade terms, is a rising power that expects partnerships, not patronage. The trade dispute with the United States was viewed by Indian policymakers as a test case for how the country would be treated in the broader global order. When the Trump administration imposed Section 232 tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum exports in 2018, it justified the move on national security grounds, a rationale that was not only seen as unjust but insulting. India exported only a fraction of steel and aluminum to the U.S., accounting for less than 2% of total U.S. imports in those categories, according to the U.S. Department of Commerce. Using national security as a justification against a long-time strategic partner like India raised alarms about the reliability of Washington's commitment to fair trade practices. In retaliation, India imposed tariffs on 28 U.S. products, including apples, almonds, walnuts, chickpea sedams, that came from politically influential states in the U.S. almond industry. For instance, heavily depends on India, which was its largest overseas market with imports valued at over $657 million in 2018. This move was aimed not just at balancing trade losses, but at sending a clear diplomatic message to Washington and the world. India will not be a passive participant in global trade. India's trade philosophy increasingly emphasizes reciprocal market access and non-discriminatory practices. This approach has been evident in its broader trade negotiations as well. In 2019, India withdrew from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership (RCEP), citing unfavorable terms that could harm its domestic industries. The decision underscored India's unwillingness to compromise its economic sovereignty for short-term benefits or geopolitical pressure. In this context, the message to global trade partners is consistent and firm. Whether it is a superpower, like the US, or a regional bloc, India demands equitable treatment. Its markets are open, but they are not up for exploitation. Any country wishing to engage meaningfully with India must first recognize its economic maturity and sovereign right to defend its national interest. India's evolving approach to foreign relations and trade has become increasingly characterized by a strong sense of national strength and independence, particularly in the face of external pressure. The U.S. tariffs imposed under the Trump administration in 2018 served as a catalyst for a deeper reflection within India about the reliability of its partnerships and the importance of strategic autonomy. Rather than respond with aggression or submission, India chose to assert its position as a confident, sovereign power that engages with the world on equal terms. The steel and aluminum tariffs, coupled with the withdrawal of India's generalized system of preferences (GSP) status in 2019, were widely viewed in India as a breach of mutual trust. The GSP program had allowed approximately $5.6 billion worth of Indian goods to enter the U.S. duty-free, benefiting small and medium-sized enterprises across multiple sectors such as engineering goods, gems and jewelry, textiles and agriculture. Its removal not only hurt exports, but also undermined the spirit of cooperation that both nations had built over decades. According to India's Ministry of Commerce, the GSP helped support hundreds of thousands of jobs across export-driven sectors, particularly in states like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Maharashtra. In response, India didn't shy away from making bold moves. Tariffs were imposed on 28 American products, signaling India's willingness to defend its economic sovereignty. But the larger shift came in the way India began to approach its international engagements. The government intensified its focus on Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, a national strategy launched in 2020 aimed at reducing dependence on imports and boosting domestic production. As part of this initiative, India set an ambitious target of $25 billion in defense manufacturing and $5 billion in defense exports by 2025, according to the Ministry of Defense. India has also taken steps to diversify its defense and trade partnerships. While the United States remains a key supplier, India has strengthened ties with countries such as France, Russia, and Israel. It has purchased Rafale fighter jets from France and S-400 missile systems from Russia. While continuing to expand indigenous projects like the Tejas light combat aircraft, this diversification reflects a broader policy shift. India will not allow itself to be overly reliant on any one nation, especially if that nation uses trade or defense ties as leverage. This emerging posture reflects a country that has moved beyond the passive diplomacy of earlier decades. India now acts from a place of strength, not obligation, and engages with global powers on its own terms. Driven by national interest and long-term strategic vision, India's assertion of power and dignity in the wake of U.S. trade actions is a reflection of its growing confidence as a global player. Over the past 2 decades, India has undergone a significant transformation from a largely inward-looking economy to one of the world's fastest-growing and most influential. According to the International Monetary Fund (IMF), India's GDP reached approximately $3.7 trillion in 2024, placing it firmly as the 5th largest economy in the world. This economic rise has been matched by greater political assertiveness and a more defined foreign policy stance focused on sovereignty, fairness, and strategic autonomy. The trade dispute with the United States, triggered by the 2018 imposition of tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum, served as a pivotal moment. Though framed by the Trump administration as a measure to protect U.S. national security, the tariffs were seen in India as symbolic of a broader disregard for the country's importance. India's steel and aluminum exports to the U.S. were modest, under 2% of total U.S. imports, making the justification appear disproportionate and targeted. Moreover, India was at the time a major defense partner of the U.S., status granted in 2016 to reflect its role as a key strategic ally in the Indo-Pacific. In response, India enacted its own tariffs on 28 U.S. goods, including major agricultural exports like almonds, apples, and walnuts. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, India was the largest export market for U.S. almonds, purchasing over $657 million worth in 2018. These targeted measures were intended to send a clear message: India would not allow economic pressure to dictate its policies or undermine its sovereignty. India's leadership has emphasized that the country's partnerships must be based on mutual respect and benefit. The government has pursued initiatives like Atmanirbhar Bharat, Self-Reliant India, launched in 2020 to reduce external dependence and foster domestic capability across sectors including defense, technology, and manufacturing. The goal is to achieve $25 billion in defense production and $5 billion in defense exports by 2025, according to India's Ministry of Defense. This new posture marks a fundamental shift. India is no longer content to be seen as a passive recipient of aid or a junior partner in international relationships. It is taking deliberate steps to define its own path, defend its interests, and assert itself as a global power whose cooperation must be earned, not assumed. India is not turning away from the world, is stepping forward with strength, clarity, and purpose. Our partnerships will be built on fairness, not fear, on respect, not pressure. And to every nation watching, India is ready to engage, ready to grow, but never ready to compromise its dignity. Asterisk.